the iron in your blood, the oxygen in your lungs, the calcium, in your bones, the carbon in your very DNA. All of those atoms were built inside the hearts of massive stars, and billions of years ago. So scientifically, we have now found this way to link ourselves to the wider universe. We wouldn't be here without this vast universe and these stars, which are like chemical factories changing one element into another.
So my conversational partner today, Dr. Stuart Clark, widely read astronomy journalist, holds a PhD in astrophysics, a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, and The Independent named him one of the stars of British astrophysics teaching. Quite a befitting title, and one I'm sure you're proud of. Dr. Stuart Clark, welcome to the Freedom Pact podcast.
Oh, hi, Lewis. It's a real pleasure to be on here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So I want to start off. I first reached out to you after I listened to you feature on one of my favorite podcasts, Brian Cox's The Infinite Monkey Cage. I really enjoyed that episode, and it's what prompted me to look into your book, Beneath the Sky, and then reach out to you to have this conversation. And so there was one thing you said on that podcast that really struck a chord with me. And as soon as I heard you say it, I think I fired off the email to you straight away. It was this idea that we share the same night sky as, all these great people from the past. We have the same night sky as a William Shakespeare, and the same night sky that we look at is it's the same one he would have looked at. And so what does that feeling mean to you, and why is that so inspiring when you think about that?
Yeah, that was a big realization for me, actually. And it came about a number of years ago when I was on a promotional book tour in Canada. And I was just talking to my audience over there, and just said quite casually, even without particularly thinking about it, we all look at the same night sky. And I was there promoting a book called The Sky's Dark Labyrinth, which is all about the history of the subject. And it struck me in that moment, of course, these are the same stars that Kepler and Galileo looked at as well. And intellectually, of course, I knew that. But there was something about that moment, about being in a faraway land in front of people, with a different culture to mine. And I realized that was the common touchstone, and not just for all of us on the planet alive today, but essentially for all of us who've sighted and who have ever lived. And so it really did. It struck me almost, like a hammer blow, that to stand beneath the night and to look at the night sky and to experience that sort of wave of feeling and emotion. That's a common human emotion. That's a common human touchstone, a common human experience. And so it gives empathy, for everyone who's ever lived almost. And that's sort of one of the ways in which this whole book, Beneath the Night, started. And I started to really dig into that and sort of mine it for everything that I could sort of get out of it.
Yeah, I remember after I listened to that, I was preparing for a podcast that evening, and it was a podcast just touching on philosophy. And so I had a few philosophy books out the back garden, and I was reading in the night. And I remember just looking up and thinking, like, all these people I'm reading about, like, rather than just reading about their ideas and then sort of existing in my mind as these almost like characters, it almost brought me that deeper connection to them, and made me realize I live in the same world that they did, and I have that sort of human connection with them, rather than them just existing as characters in my mind.
Yeah, you've got it absolutely exactly. That's the same thing that really hit me. This is a common human experience that, anyone that we meet, we could probably have this conversation and find out how that sort of influences them and affects them, how they feel when they're either beneath the night, looking up at the stars themselves, or seeing images of space online and in films and that kind of thing. How we relate to the universe is a common thing.
Well, we mentioned, I think it's your latest book there, Beneath the Night. What is it about the night sky exactly that fascinates you so much? And can you remember a sort of point in your life where, you first started to get attracted and drawn to it?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question, because I explored it a lot to try and write about it. And one of the reasons it had never occurred to me to write about this before is that I never remember a time when I wasn't fascinated by the night sky. There's just no time when I can say this was the moment that I became interested in the stars, or I was always reading about it or watching programs about it on television. If there was anything at all that was a catalyzing moment, then I think it has to be when I was 10 years old and I was in the cinema. It was 1978, and I saw Star Wars for the first time. And that brought everything together, this kind of epic, imaginative story the amazing views, of the night sky. I can remember sort of vividly the cinema being plunged into darkness as, say, the Millennium Falcon takes off from Tatooine, and having that same feeling like I had when I was outside underneath the stars, because that's effectively what it was. Suddenly the cinema went dark. There was just all these stars. But on top of that, there was this amazing orchestral music, and that really fired my interest in big. Oops, sorry. That really. Oh, I've got books falling over in here. Let me get rid of those.
A true academic.
Yeah, look at you. We're on Zoom. You can see how messy this office is. And that was like that big catalyzing moment. Everything that I loved about space, which was that, it's a real place, and yet it can be a venue for the most imaginative things that you can possibly think up. And, this big soundtrack, it all just seemed to come together for me. And in some senses, when I'm outside, beneath the night now, just looking up at the constellations, I can still tap into that childlike sense of wonder about it all.
It's interesting you mentioned Star Wars there. This is something I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about many a times, and how his experience watching these types of movies is quite different. And for you, someone with a PhD in astrophysics, how does that differ when you watch movies that are based in space, something like Interstellar or Star Wars, all these things? Are you the type of person who's sitting there watching the movie and pointing out to everyone in the room why that's wrong?
Only if they try to make it into a very big plot point.
Okay.
There's a bit in Gravity. I think it's Gravity, where there's like a tension on a tether. And I think the astronaut sort of lets himself go off the tether. There's no force that would apply in that situation. There would be no tension on that tether. So it annoys me in that sense when you're using a point of physics to try and make a big dramatic thing, and it's just daft. And one conversation with a physicist would have come up with a myriad different ways to play that scene out and achieve the same end, but still keep the science right. When we think about something like Star Wars, however, I don't mind anything that goes on in that. And the reason for that is because it doesn't pretend to be scientific. The universe there is this backdrop or a timeless story that echoes from times of classical antiquity up to the modern day, and I think will resonate with us throughout the rest of time. It's just mythic storytelling set in, so timeless stories set in a timeless universe, you know. So and I think that's one of the things that's the true magic, say, of that. It just feels right to be setting this big mythic story of heroes and villains and sidekicks and all of that, you know, in, you know, this realm of infinite possibilities.
I mentioned earlier about when I was reading some philosophy the other night, and I was, you know, reading some Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, and, you know, going back all these years and to all these older civilizations, and it made me wonder, what do we know about how older civilization viewed the night sky? What did they believe, and more importantly, what did they get out of it as humans?
Yeah, in many ways, when they looked at the night sky and tried to interpret it, they really constructed a what we'd now call a theory of everything. So it was perplexing to them why there was this beautiful universe around them. They wanted to know the reason for that, and they also noticed particular coincidences, you know, like the seasons. The constellations are different in the different seasons, and, you know, it's a natural question to ask why that is. You know, we now know, of course, it's because of the Earth's orbit around the sun, and we get the seasons because of the tilt on the Earth's axis. But they took a more direct approach than that, and they just wondered if the seasons and the weather, in fact, were influenced by what celestial objects were in the sky at that time. And so this is the beginnings of astrology as a way of trying to understand what the link between the Earth and particularly humans is with this wider cosmos. And this is, I mean, this is absolutely perennial. This thread of trying to understand how we link to the wider universe has been with us for thousands of years, I suspect, before even that. And, you know, and now we don't do it with astrology anymore because there's no measurement instrument that we can use that measures these influences. And if there's going to be influences like that, you would expect them to couple to matter in some way. You know, if we're going to be influenced by the planets and the stars, then there needs to be some force or some mechanism by which that happens. And if there's a mechanism by which it happens, then in principle, we should be able to build an instrument to measure that. And we simply can't. So they began to sort of look in that direction. Nowadays, of course, we have a scientific link to the wider universe, and that is through the build-up of atoms in the universe. So when the universe began 15 billion years ago, it was just hydrogen and helium. And still today, 98% of the universe are those two gases. And we understand how they come about. The other 2% are all the things that make things interesting. They're the elements that give us planets, that give us life. You know, the iron in your blood, the oxygen in your lungs, the calcium, you know, in your bones, the carbon in your very DNA. All of those atoms were built inside the hearts of massive stars, and, you know, billions of years ago. So scientifically, we have now found this way to link ourselves to the wider universe. We wouldn't be here without this vast universe and these stars, which are like chemical factories changing one element into another. So that's, I think, a really interesting sort of touchstone as well, you know, from the ways that, say, the ancients looked at the stars to the way we do today. And there are many other things that they did. It's very clear, you know, from sites like Stonehenge, for example, that funerary processes and how we venerate the dead seem somehow linked to the night sky. That you know, the alignment of the pyramids with the cardinal points of the compass. Those kinds of things make it look pretty incontrovertible that somehow we related death and the night sky. And of course, as soon as we have sort of written religions and things like that, we have a concept of heaven, which makes it explicit as a teaching. So it's super fascinating to look at all the different ways that we related to the night sky and continue to do so as well. So in the sense that religion is often talking about, you know, the perfect paradisical realm of heaven, which if we picture it as being anywhere, we sort of picture it as being up there, you know, somewhere in the night sky. A show like Star Trek, for example, which imagines a much better society in the future, you know, existing in space and traveling from planet to planet in starships. You know, technologically, we might reject religion and spirituality, but we hold on to the idea that the vision of utopia, as it were, can be achieved technologically and in space, for example.
Something you mentioned there about, you know, our makeup and how it, you know, how it connects and all starts with the stars. Is that where this saying comes from? I think it's Neil deGrasse Tyson that says there a lot, that we are essentially stardust.
That's exactly, yeah, where it comes from. It's the work of Fred Hoyle, the British astrophysicist, and he has a very so the story goes, it's sort of much more mundane, his version of this story. But of course, being in the mid 20th century, it seems like there was very traditional gender roles in that household. And he sort of arrived home to his wife in the kitchen one day, and he said, "I know where the iron in your saucepans comes from." And that was the way he announced that he had solved this problem of the buildup of the chemical elements. Whether that's an apocryphal story or a verified true one, I don't know.
Not as quite poetic as the way you put it, but I like it just as much. So that does give us that sort of connection to the night sky. So what do you get from the night sky? We talked a lot about those past civilizations. What do you get when you look up at the night sky, and how does it make you almost reflect back in on yourself?
Yes, that's exactly what it does. And it comes down to experiencing this feeling of awe and having the experience of sort of the sublime emotion, you know. And it's always about, look how small I am, you know, in all this vast universe, and yet I'm here to see it. You know, I am alive and conscious and trying to make sense of what it's like to be in this vast universe. And that's just one of those big cocktails of emotion. Then it seems at one level it makes you really small, you know, and yet at another level it is extremely empowering, you know, because we have these mental faculties and senses that allows us to have thoughts about thoughts and to abstract information from our environment and think about what it means. And that ultimately is inspiring to me. You know, so when I stand out beneath the night sky, I'm filled with the beauty of it, the extraordinary luck at being alive within it, you know, and, you know, a great hope to understand and to be better, and, you know, think that the future is worth, you know, worth waiting for, worth working towards, and all of those kinds of things.
When you were talking there, it reminded me of a quote. I just had to try and pull it up in front of me. It's T.S. Eliot. It says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." How does that quote make you feel?
Yeah, it's exactly that, really. It's exactly that. And one of the interesting things that I discovered whilst I was writing this book is that a lot of people who have come up through a science background You know, we are the people that kind of feel this urge and this connection in hugely, you know, in this kind of like massive sense. So an overwhelming sense that we have to, you know, devote our time, our careers and our energies to trying to understand a little bit more about a tiny part of the universe and contribute to this body of human knowledge. But so many of us can't articulate why we're driven to do that. It feels so innate that we don't even really think about it. And that was this big process that I went through in, you know, writing Beneath the Night and trying to understand why I've been enthralled to the stars literally for my whole life. And first part of that was to try and find other people who had articulated similar thoughts. And I did. I found many of them. Johannes Kepler, for example, the great German mathematician who understood mathematical orbits, or understood orbits mathematically for the very first time. He said, you know, we shouldn't ask why we're interested in the stars. And I'm really paraphrasing this. He said, because we don't ask why the songbird sings. We just accept that it's in the nature of a songbird to sing. And so we shouldn't ask why human beings want to understand, you know, the night sky, God's realm, heaven, the universe, call it whatever you want. That's just who we are. That's just totally, you know, within us. And I think it takes the more literary people to fully articulate this. And the philosophers of the 18th century did a superb job of understanding what it feels like and putting into words, you know, what it feels like to stand beneath a night sky and experience it in an emotional way rather than an intellectual way. But both of those endeavors, the intellect and the emotion, are the same route to trying to derive meaning from it.
There's a big saying in the personal development space. It's called weaponizing your curiosity. And since I started this podcast 3 years ago, I spend most of my days asking a lot of questions and being curious. And since I started asking a lot of questions, it's almost had this effect on my life. I don't know. I just feel a lot like there's a lot, my life's a lot brighter. There's, you know, I'm a bit more inspired. They seem a bit more optimistic, just all through curiosity. Do you think, how important do you think curiosity is? And do you see it as a little bit of a superpower?
Yes, I think it's absolutely essential to happiness and well-being, just to be able to, yeah, I would just be curious, just, you know, and people approach it in different ways, you know, and there's people talk about being mindful of your environment. So just noticing things in your environment around you on an everyday base sort of level and basis. And that's moving in this direction for me. It's just to just be aware of everything that's going on and be curious about why it's going on, how it's going on, and just to experience the wonder of it. That it is like this idea that there's a hidden clockwork machinery almost to the universe. And when we're curious and we look, you know, we sort of catch a glimpse of it sometimes, and little things slot into place for us. And those moments are just joyful. You make a connection between two things, and suddenly those things have meaning. You know, things don't happen for random, unconnected reasons in nature, you know, and that's, so I can, let's see, I can, you know, I can see the sun setting, and, you know, if it's very low down, behind some sort of mist or clouds or something like that, I can look at it in its entirety. I can look at it directly because the clouds are diffusing the harmful light, you know, out. And I can just think that's a beautiful sight. And, you know, my curiosity about why does the sun shine, you know, and all of that. That's led me down the path of astrophysics. So I now understand that it makes light because of nuclear fusion that's going on in the core. The core is at a couple of million degrees centigrade, you know, a temperature I can't get my head around. And then to hold it at that temperature, the sun needs to be so dense that the individual particles of light, the photons that are created in the core there, can take 100,000 years to fight their way out of the sun. And then when they get to the surface, it's 8 minutes for them to cross the 93 million miles between the sun and the earth and arrive at my eye, be registered on my retina, and fire the neurons in my brain to have these thoughts. And all of that is happening because of a process that took place in the sun before any human walked the earth. And suddenly you're in this sort of deep cosmic time realm, and you're integrally related to that. You are part of this grand sweep of cosmic history, you know, and it's just amazing. It is a superpower to sort of glimpse yourself in that broad sweep of time like that.
Absolutely. And I love this type of thinking, and some people may think it's quite depressing to, you know, to think about how small, you know, we are and how small a part we play in the observable universe. But something I've been doing over the last couple of months to sort of battle anxiety. So if I'm ever feeling really anxious about something, if there's, you know, a meeting I have to go to, and I think to myself, this is like the most important thing in the world, is, you know, it's so much pressure. It's like the biggest thing going on in my life right now. I pull up this video on my phone on YouTube where it zooms in on the Earth, and it just slowly, for 3 minutes, it just zooms out into the observable universe, and it sort of gives you perspective on just how small the planet is when we zoom out. And all of a sudden, then after I watch that, I think, okay, my problems aren't so big. Like, it's not all doom and gloom. And so it does help me to think like that. But does the size of the Earth in the observable universe make you personally feel small or inspired or empowered?
Yeah, all three really, and in some sense they're all interrelated. It does fascinate me, you see, why we are such a small part of this vast universe. You know, but I also believe that that's the kind of question that we're not equipped to answer yet. We haven't done enough work on answering the other things. So, you know, questions are sort of really easy to ask, and they come very naturally to us, and they're fun to talk around. But if one gets too caught up on getting the answers to these things, then I think it's a little bit of a trap. So the idea is to, for me anyway, is to be aware of these grand mysteries, that being one of them. Why is the universe so huge? But not wind yourself up into knots about it, and sort of bring it down to a level where you can make a meaningful contribution to you, perhaps one day humans having an answer for that.
We've talked about curiosity and how that's a superpower. So why do you think that people are so desperate in this pursuit of finding at least bacterial life on another planet? Why are we so driven by that? And I think for most of the world's population, we want that to be true. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think none of us want to be alone. You know, and that's part of what it is, and it goes towards, this is, you know, this relates to that previous question that we just had, you know, why is there such a vast universe, or, you know, why is the Earth so small in this vast universe? And perhaps the universe won't seem so small or so pointlessly large if it is widely populated. Then it's just an abode of life. So this is the interconnectedness of these big questions. So we can take that huge one, break it down, and then, you know, that comes all the way down to people in labs making instruments to look for the chemicals of life, or even, you know, microbes on Mars, for example. That's them doing something that they can. It's an achievable goal. You know, we're counseled for you know, mental health issues, we're told to set ourselves achievable goals, you know, smart goals, things that you can concentrate on and have a reasonable chance of doing. And this is sort of what the nature of good quality science is. It's to try and break things down in such a way that you can do small, incremental, achievable things in service of something that's much larger than you are.
What do you think is more scarier, being alone in the universe or not being alone in the universe?
I mean, it's super interesting, isn't it? Because if you know, if we are alone in the universe, in some senses, that puts a lot of pressure on us. And you know, this conversation and this discussion, you know, people like Arthur C. Clarke, you know, did a lot of discussion of this kind of thing, and a lot of his novels are about exactly that. What does it mean to be alone in the universe? You know, what if there are other life forms in the universe? They're so far removed from us, we can't relate to them in any way. Does that make us feel even more alone? Or, you know, so what is the scarier one? I don't know, is the answer. It's one of those questions that I've genuinely had an open mind about.
Yeah.
I haven't got a set idea of whether there must or must not be other life in the universe. I'm fascinated to find out, though.
I mentioned your appearance on the Infinite Monkey Cage at the top of this conversation. One of the things that you talked about was the idea of us being the consciousness of the universe. I wonder if you could just expand and explain that to the audience.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting, you know, thought. And again, it's not unique to me. You know, the science fiction writers have talked about this, and Carl Sagan as well. You know, we are able to understand the universe. In principle, we're able to understand the universe, and that's what a lot of us, you know, spend our lives doing. And even if we're not working astronomers, a lot of us are fascinated to find out more and to be entertained by these programs about the wider universe. And you know, we have these mental faculties that can see the universe and can make sense of it. So at the same time, we are not removed from the universe. We are part of the universe, and we are, you know, perhaps an essential outworking of the physics and the chemistry of the universe. You know, physics comes first in the universe, interactions between particles, and as those interactions become more complex and the particles themselves begin to interact and bond together, so they take on chemical identities, and you get to chemistry. And similar thing happens when those chemicals interact at a sufficiently complex level. We cross a threshold into biology, and we don't know exactly how that happens at the moment. You know, the origin of life is one of the key scientific mysteries. And then, you know, you see the same thing happening. We have this process of more and more complex living cells, which start working together into multicellular organisms. And then at some point, we get consciousness appearing in that as well with us. And that allows us to work together to build societies and define cultures. And that allows us to look at the universe and understand the universe. So that's what I was meaning by that. You know, we sort of are the consciousness of the universe, in a way. Now, what that means, I've no idea. That's something for us to think about. It may be, you know, that when we think about the early philosophers, that they were very interested, first and foremost, in what was the universe, what made up the universe, and then they became interested in how do I live a good life. I'm lucky enough to be alive in this universe. So what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to live a good life within this universe? And maybe we're kind of going through a rerun of that sort of thinking. So since the scientific revolution, we've been able to more accurately determine the nature and the content of the universe. And at the present time, we are going through this new upheaval of thinking about how society and culture can best live in the universe, by which, of course, we first mean the Earth. And so we want to truly understand, how to sustainably live in our environment. What are the consequences of what we are doing? This is just the same processes, just abstracted from an individual basis up to the level of society now. And so perhaps that's what will happen if our technology improves enough so that we will, colonize space or begin exploration of space. We'll then have to have this same sort of soul searching again. What does it mean to be, a citizen of the galaxy? I think it was Robert Heinlein who coined that phrase.
We've talked about a lot of topics that are related to the book we've already mentioned, Beneath the Night, this idea of the connection between the universe and how it reflects on us as humanity, and a lot of highbrow stuff. But I put on the newsletter the other day that you were coming on the show, and I went into your background, and one of the questions I was begged to ask you, a bit of low-hanging fruit for you here, but this billionaire space race we have going on at the moment. Obviously, Elon Musk, and then Jeff Bezos said he was going to be on the first commercial flight to space, and then I think it was Richard Branson that came out and announced that he was going to actually do it 7 days earlier. How do you react to this? Do you think it's for the right reasons? As an astrophysicist, how do you look upon this story as it unfolds?
Yeah, so there are two things to this. One is a very emotional point of view, and again, one is a sort of an intellectual point of view. And I find it fascinating that it has taken super wealthy individuals to make this happen. So even a super wealthy individual is not as rich as, a whole country. And yet we haven't properly sort of done this kind of going up and down to space for tourism or things like that. Talked about it a huge amount, especially in the middle part of the 20th century, that this was going to happen, and yet for various different reasons, often political, often to do with the way companies interface with governments and the vast quantity of finance that's usually needed to do anything in that way. We haven't done this. So it takes two competing billionaires, and don't forget, Elon Musk is just sort of quietly getting on, and he's, I hesitate to say, it makes me smile to even think that Elon Musk is not grandstanding, but but in comparison to Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson at the moment, Elon's taking quite a, he's keeping it on the down low. But he's the one that's got the contracts with NASA to supply the space station and to build the rockets to go to the moon and these kinds of things. So it fascinates me that it takes individual people who just decide, I want to do this just because I want to do it. And we've reached a time where they can apply their business thinking to cost efficiency. And we've reached a sort of a technological era as well, where it's the material sciences and all those things are cheap enough to do this. So I wonder if it's just inevitable that this is the way it was going to happen. The thing to worry about is having some sort of Wild West free-for-all up there. So the launch of all these, the mega constellations, Elon Musk's Starlink satellites, where the UK's OneWeb constellation and many others, we're talking about putting tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of satellites in orbit, all of which will affect our view of the night sky, all of which will degrade the work of astronomers, forcing them, to become cleverer and smarter about what they do and how they do it. But, all of them blocking our view of the natural night sky. Now, it may be that this is just one of those key philosophical turning points in history, that from now on, we will never see the night sky as this, mostly natural, unadulterated place anymore. That this is just, humans expanding their dominion. Only, sort of future history will be able to tell. What I do think, to answer the question, is that we need a lot of talking about this. We do need to have these conversations about what do we want to do in space. It comes back to the old philosophy of how do we live good lives again. What do we want to do in space? How do we want to do that? And how do we want to minimize the effects of doing that on the wider environment, of the night sky? Let's see space, and there are moves in this direction and discussions, within the astronomical community about this, about seeing space as not a nothing, but as an environment that needs conservation and sustaining, just in the same way that any environment on Earth does, and indeed on Mars or any other planet does.
It's certainly interesting to see how it plays out. It's definitely one to keep your eyes on. Before we move into the final questions, the other email that really struck me, quite passionately written, as most conspiracy theorists are, but I did get an email explaining to me why the moon landing was fake. Gotta be honest, didn't read the entire email, gave up after a few sentences. But I wonder, for someone like yourself, you must have to, deal with this sort of question quite regularly. How do you respond to these types of people?
It does crop up a fair bit. And what interests me the most about it is I still struggle to understand the motivation for wanting to believe that it was faked. I kind of do. I do struggle. I think a lot of these people are genuinely sincere. They're not crackpots, and they spend a lot of time and effort, and their curiosity is dialed up. And what I think it is about, it's about a mistrust of authority and government. That actually we have reached a position where, we should believe that our politicians, our leaders, and our governments are working for the good of the countries that they represent. And yet there are numerous examples where that's clearly not the case. And this breeds a distrust, that is then all pervasive. And so that's how I've sort of come to understand or come to peace with the rise of this belief that we never went to the moon. And it has risen, throughout my career. I see it a lot more now, and the return of the flat Earth, people wanting to believe that as well. We did go to the moon. I can't see the vehicles on the moon, through a telescope. The day will come when we're able to do that. Our telescopes will be good enough that you can look and you can just, see the landers and things that are on there. We take pictures of them from orbit, around the moon all the time. But of course, then, it's being, it can be, it's a fake picture, and all of that kind of stuff. So these people that believe this, so long as they're not aggressive,
Yeah.
I'm really fine to talk to them and understand their points of view, because I think it's about a deeper thing than the moon landings themselves.
Fantastic. I love that. So the final two questions I have for you. We've mentioned your latest book, Beneath the Night. I'm sure it's going to impact so many people's lives. But for you, what books have you read in your life that have had a massive impact on you and your career?
Cosmos by Carl Sagan. I mean, that was where I just fell in love with this kind of holistic thinking. Sagan was such I mean, he was a philosopher almost more than he was a scientist. He understood science extremely well, and he was fascinated by the origin of life problem. I suspect that the work that he was doing is not the one that will solve the problem for us. But he completely understood how you do science and how you do objective science. But then he could see these things in the wider context. So we had we briefly discussed about Fred Hoyle talking about the iron pots and pans, and then the much more poetic phrase about we are all stardust. Well, Carl Sagan had one similar about that same subject as well, and this was in the Cosmos book. And he said, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to first create the universe. And that's his way of talking about the buildup of atoms and what it takes to get to something as simple and taken for granted as an apple pie. And this goes back to our point about curiosity. Isn't that amazing that you can make those kinds of leaps?
Yeah.
Another huge influence was James Burke's Connections. And this was a program that I watched before I read the book, and I watched it when I was quite young. And to be honest, I didn't really understand what was going on in that program. James Burke lost me a few minutes into most of those programs. But there was something so compelling about where he started to where he finished, and all the different places he went to along the way. I was gripped by it. And I remember thinking, one day I'm going to understand that. That just seems like, a goal I want to be able to listen to that and understand how all these things, fit together. So those were two huge, and we talked about Star Wars already. So that was, and that's the big emotional investment, and and just sense of wonder and awe at the whole thing. So all the works of Arthur C. Clarke, my goodness, there's, he may not be able to write characters, but boy, can he talk about ideas. And if you read them at the right age, I think, well, any age, if you're an open-minded person, gosh, do they make you think. It's just super fascinating stuff.
The last question before we start to wrap up, I ask every guest. This could be anything. It could be your family, it could be your friends, it could be curiosity, it could be work, it can be wherever you want. For Dr. Stuart Clark right now, what makes a life worth living?
My guitars all behind me.
Wow.
They call to me, and I can just, in the same way I can lose myself under the night sky, I can lose myself in just sitting here and just playing. Yeah, what makes my life worthwhile? It's being in service to something bigger than myself, and that's astronomy. And that's making my own little contributions to the human experience, and trying to push our understanding, to do this, to talk to people like yourself, to make this connection with someone else who's thinking along these same lines. That's actually what makes it worthwhile. And the reason I really think that is because science, when you get something right with science, that is in the bag. Newton's laws are, they're never going to not be right. We may extend our ideas to different circumstances and different phenomena where those laws don't apply, as Einstein did with general relativity. But Newton's laws are in the bank forever. So we can, through science, we can genuinely, build this corpus of knowledge which can't be knocked down. We can choose to disregard it, but so long as we keep it alive, in books and colleges and things like that, it's there forever and can be picked up and doesn't need to be rediscovered. So that's that's what makes it all worthwhile for me.
Amazing. And one thing on that subject as well, one thing I think you do really well, it's the same with Brian Cox. When I was in school, when I was in GCSEs, I remember I had I was interested in the subject, but I was never really good at science, physics. So I was in my GCSEs, I didn't take physics, but I remember there was an option, there was a sort of extracurricular thing outside of school. After school finished, you stayed for 2 hours if you wanted. And one of the activities was to do a GCSE in astronomy, strangely enough. And I remember I watched a Brian Cox documentary at the time. And it just it was so relatable to, it's so relatable to people who aren't, that academically minded, aren't deep into the physics. It makes it relative and, makes a connection with the everyday person. And that inspired me to, to do that little bit of extracurricular there and take that GCSE. And I think that, people like Brian, people like Neil deGrasse Tyson does a really good job. I think his book, Astrophysics for People in a Hurry, is a really good example of that. And I think, the way that you convey your messages does exactly the same, because there's a lot of people in that space where they can write and talk about it all day long, but it's only going to be understood by one kind of person. Whereas I think the work you do speaks to everyone and everyone can understand it. So I thank you for that as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Lewis. It's just such a pleasure, because the night sky, the universe, this understanding, it is for everyone. And Brian is such an exponent at it. He truly understands what excites people and engages people, and can translate these subjects, in that way. And Neil deGrasse Tyson has his own kind of off the wall personality and his approach at doing this. And this is one of the beauties of it, is that it instantly, it tells you that there's not just one single sort of classroom way to approach this. Yeah, you can just love it and express this interest in the universe and what we know about it. And you don't have to understand the maths. You can just be curious and be fascinated and trust the people that do.
Absolutely. Look, let these guys know where they can find out more from yourself, and check out Beneath the Night. Where can they find you and all those books?
Yeah, so you can find me online. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Stu Clark, DrStuClark, and I'm online at a woefully out-of-date website called www.stuartclark.com.
Amazing. I'll link all those links in the description below for everyone to check out. Dr. Stuart Clark, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I knew from the first time I listened to you on that podcast, I knew that we could have a really interesting and engaging conversation, and I'm feeling inspired, man. So thank you so much for bringing the value to the show today.
Oh, you're so welcome, Lewis. I feel inspired talking to you as well. So please stay in touch. It's because, the podcast that you do is amazing. It since you brought it to my attention, I've been listening, and it's super inspiring.